Who was the richest person you've met? Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Story 1. Met Bruce Willis in his hometown. Bought drinks for all his old classmates and others at a local bar. He was regular dude around his old homies. Story 2. Shared an elevator W.J. Bezos and his security dude after the Joker movie 2019. Didn't know it was him until I got off and my GF told me who it was, LOL. Story 3. As a lawyer, I had a client who was worth $1.2 billion. I was doing his prenup for his young new GF. Seemed like a nice guy. Wouldn't expect him to be rich at all. Answer. I have known 2 legit billionaires. Both have multiple buildings that bear their names, massive charitable foundations, college endowments and scholarships in their names, etc. They tick all the billionaire boxes except the lavish lifestyle. Both live D, one passed on a few years ago, in homes that are super nice but far from lavish. One drove a 10-year-old Mercedes and the other has a Lexus SUV. Both were basically ski bums who you were likely to bump into in the grocery store. You'd never have a clue that either was worth billions if you didn't know beforehand. Story 4. Not sure how much, but I used to caddy at a prestigious country club that was impossible to get a membership at. It was called Kitten Set Country Club in Marion, Massachusetts. Lot of old money hiding out in that little seaside town. Anyway, I always got stuck with this guy named Montgomery. The bare minimum they had to pay for a caddy was 12 for 18 holes that took AB 312 HRs. He never gave me a penny more than that 12 while other kids were getting $100, $200 tips. One time he asked me if I wanted a hot dog and soda at the 9th hole pit stop. I said, sure, thanks. He took it out of the 12 when he paid me LOL. I just knew that's the type of shoot only the ultra wealthy would do. And his name was Montgomery. Only wealthy dudes get named Montgomery. Answer. Old money rarely gets that old. There's a generation that makes it and usually a max of 2, but often 1, that spend it. Your guy was probably generation 2 or 3, clinging to the trappings of being part of an old money family, but in reality probably running low on the old money and terrified of running out or having to actually work for a living. Story 5. This guy who owns a large construction company, he has a private gallery with lots of interesting things such as rare fossils, minerals, and petrified wood. He also has a serious collection of Roman Byzantine artifacts. He hosts many events that are basically public at his gallery, and I think he's a great person. Answer. There's a local guy who comes in our office. Absolute redneck. Is always driving a single cab white pickup truck with the company name on it. Guy owns a little construction company. Come to find out he mainly handles government contracts doing jobs nobody wants in places nobody wants to go. He's worth billions, owns 2 islands in the Caribbean, and thousands of rental houses. He bought a mansion in Mexico on the Pacific coast that he forgot about until the caretaker called to tell him about storm damage. Story 6. I know a guy worth around $700 million that you would never suspect when seeing him out in public. Just looks like a great-grandfather buying fishing lures at Walmart. Answer. Yep. Friend from high school sold his startup for something like $250 million and got close to 50 of it for himself. Some kind of data company his college friends started together. Dude lives in a regular 2-story family home in Long Island, NYLOL, and not even an exclusive neighborhood or the Hamptons. Just a regular suburban area. My parents' house is nicer, and they're definitely not worth $50 million LOL. Regular jerk guy, but he spends all his money on the newest tech and gaming gear. Won't wow you with his modest Lexus or closet that's 99 Uniqlo sales section, but best believe his multiple gaming setups would make most men jealous. He has a PC for shooters FPS, a VR PC, and a racing sim PC, all worth $10K or more each. Story 7. One of my good friends is worth about $50 million or so, which is pretty fudge rich. He made it building super low latency interconnects for big banks, so they could screw regular people over. So take from that what you will. Haha. Story 8. I'm a senior executive in Silicon Valley and have met a few billionaires. Richest person that would quickly respond to a text is probably 500 million. Story 9. I had once breakfast with the owner of an MLB team. The one time I have sat at a table of like 6 people where everyone watched one guy pick up the check and no one even pretended to fight him over it. Like, bro, I'm okay with you buying me bacon and eggs, and I'm pretty sure you're okay with it too. Answer. I had a friend in high school who was an usher at Seattle Mariners games in the late 90s when Safecourt Mobile first opened. Some of us went to a game when he happened to be working, and he came up to us with 3 tickets and said, "See those empty seats right behind the visitors' dugout? Those are your new seats. We started chatting with a nice older woman who seemed to know an awful lot about the Tampa Bay Rays. I said something like, "Wow, you seem to go to a lot of Rays games." She responded, "Well, I have to. My husband owns the team." He might have said 2 words the whole time, but his wife was very pleasant. Story 10. My limo driver, Frank. He's rich in spirit, very helpful when I get poisoned by my constituents as well. Story 11. A client that owned a huge empire of sand and gravel. Crazy dude, broke all the rules, eventually donated $100 to build a local hospital. Story 12. Elon Musk. I was in a Tesla store in London looking around, and this would have been 2015 to 16, so before he went nuts. And he just walked over to me, asked me how long I'd been in the store, and if any staff had spoken to me. We chatted for a couple of minutes about the Model S. Then he went to the staff area in the store. The rest of the staff did not look like they were expecting to see him just stroll in through the front door. Story 13. I still don't know who he was, but I used to do delivery for Uber. Got this order from a gas station for like a burrito or something. Going to drop off, and I get a text saying to text when you arrive. You'll know it when you see the 2 lion statues in front. Sure enough, there was 2 lion statue in front of a large gate. Text the number back, and the gate started opening. I had to drive like 30 seconds down a road until I saw this gigantic house. It was the size of like a Walmart. There was a fountain in front of the house, and off to the side was clearly a private garage with a bunch of cars. The weirdest thing was who was there. This guy had like his entire living room sitting in front of the house. He was on a clearly expensive laptop doing work or something. He was wearing like cheap basketball shorts and a plain blue shirt. Super friendly though. Just handed him the bag and he smiled and said thank you. He said the gate would open on the way out. Just unforgettable experience. Like he was clearly rich enough to buy whatever he wanted, yet got a gas station burrito. Was wearing cheap clothes, yet the house and garage and fountain and his laptop clearly said he was filthy rich. Yeah, I still wonder who he was. Story 14. Henry Fonda. My mom's cousin is Shirley Fonda, so back in the 70s, we went to visit them at his Bel Air mansion. I was 12, and remember how shocked I was that he was so down to earth. He was tending to his beehives dressed in old blue jeans. We got to swim in his pool, which had a concrete diving platform with 2 concrete lions on both sides. I remember that there were amazing chandeliers in every room in the house. Before we left, we all got pictures taken with him. He was just a super nice man. Story 15. Richest man I ever knew was in Citrus in South Florida. He was incredibly humble and seemed sometimes embarrassed by his wealth because his father had flaunted it. He was incredibly generous, but in a very quiet way. He actively looked for ways to help people. The only signs of his money were in the facts that he was on the board of directors of several banks in several states, and the size of his quietly given gifts. His everyday dress was work boots, cargo shorts, and worn polo shirts. If you asked him what he did, he would tell you he was a farmer. He had a beautiful wife who genuinely loved him, and 2 great kids. He committed tragic ends several years ago, and no one knows why. He was a good friend, and I think of him often. If I were ever wealthy, he's what I would aspire to be. Story 16. I used to work at an upscale athletic club in the Seattle area. Bill Gates was a regular. I can't say for certain I've ever met him, but I used to see him around a lot. I taught swim lessons to the children of a few lesser billionaires, but I only really ever spoke to their wives and nannies. I hosted a birthday party for one of the Nordstrom's kids and did actually meet the dad. I think it was Eric. There was always a lot of tech money around, but they were generally nondescript 50-year-old white guys. I really only got starstruck when famous athletes would show up. Story 17. The silent partner when Studio 54 got caught avoiding taxes from cash. Dude also was part owner of Crazy Eddie's from the 70s, 80s. Story 18. Russian oligarch with contacts to fudge I don't know who, not sure I even want to know. Let's just say that rich Russians are more superstitious than your average horoscope New Age girl. Story 19. I worked for a charity and we got visited by Melinda Gates. She came around to speak to each of us, which I thought was very nice. Story 20. We have a legit billionaire in our family, my Emil's sister, and their male body part. Most greedy, non-loving assholes. But they live the life you'd imagine a billionaire would live. Homes in Whistler, San Diego, south of France, and like 6 other places. They fly private everywhere, but never invite anyone else in the family. And there's like 8 siblings. Story 21. I used to work at a rich hotel. I'd see wealthy people all the time. I'd say the richest was one of the higher-ups in BP. He was actually really nice. He left behind a 500 pair of Sennheiser noise-canceling headphones. Tired to get a hold of him for 3 months with no reply. I still have them. They sound fantastic. Story. 22. My brother was a male nanny for rich families, so I met Libet Johnson, the heirs of the Johnson family. Her and her adopted son, William, lived in a 12-story mansion in Manhattan near Central Park. This kid was like 9 when I met him and had an elevator that goes to his room. Story 23. I knew a land developer in Maryland in the 90s. $1 million home, yacht, expensive cars. He had such bad anxiety he couldn't park his own yacht one time. He wanted to be a novelist. He couldn't keep it in his pants and created a mess of families. I don't know how many wives, exes, and kids he had. His wife at the time complained to barely scraping by me that she couldn't afford a new fall wardrobe and new fancy shoes and bags because the business was off. Oh, boo-hoo, Kiki. Stuff it up your butt. He went to school with my husband, so that's why they were cavorting with pores. Plus, my husband could park a yacht. Story 24. I once fixed Robert Mondavi's wife's internet. She was super nice. She was in a wheelchair at that time and had a caregiver and housekeeper in the house with her. That house is fudge amazing. I've worked in a number of mansions all around California, and this was nicer than any of them. While not huge, it was basically like a curated museum. From the minute you pull into the driveway, you just feel like you're surrounded by awesome. The master bedroom was truly a trip. 34 of it was round with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Napa Valley. Truly incredible view. I probably worked in richer people's houses, but that was the most awesome. Story 25. I used to work for a billionaire, peed next to him in the urinals many times. He definitely didn't know my name, but knew my face and would give me a, hey, what's up? We must have had very similar bladder sizes and water consumption. Story 26. I had to do a presentation at my work a few weeks ago for Zhongshan Shan, one of China's richest people. He's worth around $60 billion. Story 27. The richest is probably Jerry Jones or Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, but Sheikh's true net worth is never really public. Also met and collaborated with Arnold Schwarzenegger and is a self-made billionaire. Story 28. Warren Buffett or Larry Ellison, depending who was richer at the time, watching the America's Cup on Ellison's yacht in SF Bay and was allowed to join adults for the party. Talked to Buffett for quite a while, said hello and congratulations to Ellison. Story 29. A man who donated a crap ton of money to the nonprofit I work for. He made the money he donated to us from mint-condition Pokemon cards. He used to be a distributor. He is passionate, but quite strange. Story 30. Ran into Taylor Swift while leaving a bathroom one time. She's a billionaire now, but this was 5 years ago when she was just a multimillionaire. Story 31. John Saul, worth 6B, he invented the software, JMP. I use daily for statistical analysis. Sat next to him at a JMP conference in Europe. He's still a normal, humble guy. Didn't even realize he was worth that much until a couple of his employees were talking at a bar that night about hoping to ride back to the US on his private jet. Story 32. I was in the Marine Corps. One of my people asked if he could get a 96-hour pass. He wanted to fly to California for his sister's wedding. I told him he might want to take leave. He said he had used all his leave. I couldn't find the Palatine seniors, and I went to the company Gunny. He in the first searching said only with a round-trip airline ticket, confirmed reservation. I told him what I was told. He gave the sad-eyed look. Dad said he would send the plane. I didn't know how to answer and went back to the company office. I told the first sergeant twice he wanted to see him and a phone call was made. Then he left Friday morning and came back on Monday afternoon. I guess technically his family was rich. Story 33. I don't know everyone's net worth these days, but a fairly educated guess is Kevin Smith, writer, director, actor of the New Jersey Chronicles movies, Clerks, Chasing Amy, Mallrats, Dogma, etc. He was doing his QA tour around American colleges, and I spoke with him for a bit before he chatted up my friend on the phone. Super chill guy. Story 34. My mom's cousin is worth about 500, 600 million. I only ever meet him at weddings and funerals. She always spoke highly of him. He didn't even bother to come to her funeral. Story 35. Ken Morrison and his family. We had holidays in the same place. In 2007, the Sunday Times had his worth at 1.35 BN. I've met Richard Harpin a couple of times. He sold his company for 4.2 BN, but I think his stake was about 900 millions. I've met a few others with net worth in the 100, 300 million range. Story 36. Scott Budnick, movie producer, director. He either made or helped with all the Hangover movies, Project X, some more. He helps incarcerated people change their ways when they get out. He even has his own company. I think it's called ARS, Anti-Recidivism Coalition. I met him while I was at an inmate fire camp. He would come by a lot. He even helped me get a job at CAL FIRE. Really cool dude. Story 37. I once shook hands with Warren Buffett when my best friend won the Alice Buffett Award for Outstanding Educator and took me as his +1 to the banquet. Story 38. Depends on if you count everything being paid up. My grandfather has everything paid for off. After being fired from a really good job, he worked at least 20 years. My uncle easily makes more in a year than anyone in the entire family, but will attempt to live like he has $600,000 year if he's making $300,000 year, and everything will be repoed when he eventually loses his job. Story 39. I've been on first name basis with 2 billionaires at different times in my life, and Trip Hawkins throws a hell of a party. Story 40. Iconasuerta. I drove tow truck in northern San Diego County in the 80s, 90s. Met a ton of ball players. Bip Roberts, Tony Gwinnett, Raleigh Fingers, Randy Jones, Gary Templeton. His wife was such a doll. But I think the richest person was some no-name dude that had me flatbed a new Corvette from the dealer home to his garage. I got to his home garage and it was big enough for me to pull inside and unload. About 80 FT by 120 feet, he had his car's angle parked down both sides. The first thing to catch my eye were the 3-4 GT40s, Lamborghini Countach, and a handful of Ferraris. He easily had 50 cars in there in the same class. Story 41. Ran into a former client, at the time he was a hotelier, at a concert a few months after he sold the rights to his mobile game for 600 mounts. Story 42. After our train broke down, I once shared and paid for an hour's taxi ride with a Pakistani chap who I later learned, from looking online, was a billionaire industrialist. He gave me his number and invited me to visit. But after discovering he was a billionaire, I chickened out of calling him. I regret that. Story 43. I met a guy that owned the majority of the concession rights in the Atlanta airport. We were on a hunting trip in Wyoming. He said he made more money during the trip than the trip cost him to take. Story 44. As a kid, nobody in my family ever told me who they called me down to shake their hand for was rich or not. While working in the IT department of a bank in my early 20s, I met a few rich people who frankly nobody here knows, so I won't bother. Let me tell you this. You've met people 10 times as rich as the richest people you met that looked rich. Most wealthy people cut out coupons in the newspaper and live like any normal middle-income family. The opulent ones with the designer clothes get either mocked or just ignored. That's my experience. Story 45. Founder and owner of Intero Real Estate, Gino Blafari. He sold the affiliates to Berkshire Hathaway for something in the ballpark of $50 million and went on to run Berkshire Real Estate. Essentially, Buffett was buying him as a leader. Super nice guy, really inspiring, and always remembered everyone's name, no matter where they were at under him. If there's ever someone who deserves to be rich, based on betting on himself and the way he treated everyone around him and the talent he attracted, it's that guy. Very open about his faith, thought processes and what he did to get to where he was at, and I feel fortunate to have worked with him for the time that I did. Story 46. I spent a bit of time with Vince McMahon. I'm built like I have a week to live, but I joke that I was really a tough guy as I managed to beat up Fat Damon the school bully when I was 12. On the strength of that, he said I could come wrestle for him. I think a man of his standing should know that that constitutes a legally binding job offer as a wrestler. So I dine out on that fact during icebreakers before telling the less glamorous truth. Shaking hands with the Big Show, by the way, is like shaking hands with a head. Story 47. Ex-stepfather. He ran and continues to run a lot of food companies, runs operations and big on the admin ownership of things. When him and my mom were together, he was making about $250,000, $300K a year. Now it's closer to $1 million, according to my mom. We lived in a pretty nice house in an expensive coastal city, went on plenty of vacations, they had nice cars, even bought my little sister Gucci tennis shoes all. I'm not sure I'll ever be around big money like that again. Story 48. Bernard Arnault. Met him accidentally, and everyone I've ever met that's met him says he's kind of an asshat. I can't really say one way or the other, just what I've heard. Didn't treat me badly or anything, just happened to ask someone a question that he was talking at, and it was more who's that guy, and they introduced me. Story 49. The old guy, I'm renting a house in Switzerland, drives an old Citroen with mismatched panels, and owns pretty much half the Swiss village, and is building 2 new apartment complexes near me. Doesn't even have a management company. All issues I have, I just have to call him. Beside him, my boss who goes sailing on a whim and who bought the dip in 2008 with around a few $100K. Didn't take out anything yet, but he put in a few extra over the years. He dresses very, very casual and doesn't have a car. Has a bicycle and takes the train most often, LOL. Story 50. Dan Snyder, when he owned the former Redskins. He brought Bruce Allen with him down our strip of bars, and they were insufferable. 10 tipping douchebags. Story 51. I worked at a high-end steakhouse. A Saudi sheik and his entourage of 12 wives, bodyguards, and attendants bought out the restaurant after hours for a meal. It was surreal. I watched a man open the wine list, then run his finger through the whole thing until he came to the highest price. Ordered something like 8 bottles of Chateau Petrus at around $1,600 each, just to get started. Wild. Worked at another restaurant that catered to the man who at that time owned all of Budweiser's distribution for the Southeast U.S. Very rich, very good old boy, very irritable. Answer. A friend's son has a startup in CA. He needed funding, and someone in London was interested. So he meets the guy in London and he buys $1,000 wines. Then this guy mentions that they should go watch a soccer game the next day or so. So the CA guy checks the prices, and it's like $5K, so he politely says no. Obviously, he never got any money from the British guy. Story 52. A guy in my high school class had a high-level Wall Street job, and when he left, was worth $235 million. Story 53. I'm not sure, but he was bragging about how he lost $3 million already while sitting down to play blackjack in Vegas. Then he bought expensive jerk champagne for everyone at the table, and I really wanted to ask if he'd rather pay off my student loans instead. Story 54. There's an old man and woman in town that are worth over $300 million. I work on their air conditioners every now and then. His family owned big sawmills back in the early 1900s and supplied most of the lumber for the armed forces during W2. She inherited a bunch of oil wells that weren't producing very much until they figured out a better way to get oil out of the ground, and they've been pulling money from that for at least the last 20 years. These people are in their 80s. She loves having yard sales, and he has to keep an eye on her so she doesn't sell any of his clothes. One time I had to go check on something, and they had just gotten back from a doctor's appointment that was in a city 60 miles away. He said, "Come here, let me show you something." He opened the refrigerator door and pulled out a styrofoam to-go container. Inside was a large, half-eaten, loaded baked potato. I kind of looked at it and he says, "Guess where I got it?" "I don't have a clue," I told him. Then he goes into detail about a little restaurant on the way to the doctor that makes them, and they always stop there and split half of the potato at the restaurant, and then they eat the other half for supper. I did run into them at a casino one time, so I guess they weren't as frugal as it assumed they were from the potato. But I just thought it was so odd of him to show me that potato. Story 55. John C. May, CEO of John Deere. He usually walks past me in the office on Tuesday mornings. I'm barely awake at that time, but usually wave say good morning. Story 56. A decade ago, I was studying in Ireland. Nothing wild here, right? On some random night, one of my friends and I decided to grab beers at some random pub in the northern half of Dublin. We sit down and grab a pint and chat about whatever. Probably half an hour later, this entourage walks in, and we think nothing of it until we get up to order another round. "Lads, all your drinks are paid for tonight," I get told, and think it is odd, but whatever. Then comes basically a caricature of a Saudi prince, and one of his entourage announces his name and lets everyone know that the drinks will flow. One of them comes over to us and asks why we are still drinking Guinness, instead of having something better. And hey, I like Guinness and don't want to ruin the hospitality by being greedy. My friend jumped up and ran to the bar, and I didn't see him the rest of the night. So a minute later, the prince walks over and basically says, "Quit drinking poor people adult beverage." And I thank him, but this is fine for me. Needless to say, he didn't approve of that and gestures for a briefcase. And boom, here is me sitting here like those idiots at the steakhouse when the fake military guys protect the steak in the suitcase, as the idiot opens it repeatedly. "Have a drink with me," he says as someone takes out 2 pristine whiskey glasses and pours something that appeared to be whiskey into them. Sorry, I only speak English, I couldn't read it. So here is me hanging out with some guy who just handed me a drink worth my entire net worth in it and tells me to drink it. 5 minutes later, he gets up and tells me to enjoy the top shelf and don't feel guilty before he goes off to another table. The next day, I asked my friend if he knew the guy's name, and he just kind of looked at me and said, "Dude, free drinks." And I accepted that he didn't know or care why it happened. Story 57. I used to work at a very prestigious hotel in NYC. We had a guest who used to pay to have the toilets changed in his suite every time he came. Just complete FU money. Story 58. Not me, but my friend met Donald Trump in a casino in Vegas 45 years ago. But who knows if he was rich then? It might have been during one of his bankruptcy times. Story 59. I work for a privately held company that employs about 20K people. I've met most of the family that owns it. including the chairman of the board. No idea what their collective net worth is, but it's in the billions. Story 60. My sister's husband. Old money comes from his dad company. It kind of makes it difficult to not compare our lives. Just for the record, me and my wife are doing great careers and have enough money for life and hobby, but we're one generation behind the money they have at their disposal. Story 61. Two richest, the owner of both an NFL team and an NBA team, a founder of a tech company, both billionaires. Met a retired NFL QB and a Wimbledon champ yesterday. Story 62. Mitzi Perdue. It's probable you've never heard of her. She was married to Frank Perdue, the guy from the Perdue chicken commercials back in the 80s and 90s. I knew she was wealthy because of that marriage, but what I learned recently is that she is also an heir to the Sheraton Hotel fortune. She's worth about $22 billion. She was an active supporter of a not-for-profit I worked for about 10 years ago. I met her several times in the office and during fundraisers. She is an incredibly nice and down-to-earth person, and except for dressing quite well, you'd never expect she was quite so wealthy. Story 63. I know a guy whose net worth is $14.6 billion from his family's engineering, construction, and project management company. Story 64. Met Jimmy Iovine, who is Dress Beats by Dre partner, in Vegas at a pool party years ago. He was pretty chill, but I imagine Charlie Sheen, who was awesome, might have more money. Served Tom Hanks once, not sure who takes the cake though. Charlie is the coolest though, by far. Story 65. When I was younger and a little bit nerdier than I am now, I sneaked into Elstree Studios while they were filming pickup scenes for Attack of the Clones. At one point, George Lucas walked past me with a whole entourage in tow. This was, of course, when he was at $4 billion richer from selling Star Wars to Disney, but still surely incredibly wealthy. As the above is arguably stretching the definition of met, though, the next in line would be meeting Shirley Manson, Butch Vig, and the other members of Garbage on various occasions, as they're my favorite band by far. Story 66. 2 words, indoor pool. It also sucked. The entire house reeked of chlorine. You couldn't walk anywhere dry. The middle of the entire house was taken up by water. The section floor was just a balcony reaching around, so it didn't cover the pool. The humidity was so uncomfortable, I can't imagine actually living there. They also had a pool right out back. Story 67. I worked for the family that sold Judge Judy Florida House to her. Gated community like 10-12 rooms, 10-12 bathrooms. They were on the last Concorde flight. The mom, I worked for the daughter, one of the kindest, down-to-earth sweet woman I'd ever met. Husband POSing. Daughter was also very nice, intelligent, also married a jerk. Patterns. Story 68. I was once working a Little League baseball tournament, and the owner of the local pop distributor dropped off free pop for the volunteers. It was, and still is, a nice gesture. We lived in a smallish city. Turns out, dude is worth hundreds of millions. The story goes that he was offered the distribution rights for the region way back in the 70s, with exclusivity forever. Apparently, they tried to sue to get the rights back after the area boomed, but to no avail. He always did delivery and just hired others to run the business. Super nice guy. Story 69. Started a job in a cash converters type shop, the mid-2000s. A couple of years later, the owners got bought out. The new owner was a super rich accountant. He gave us a bunch of expensive watches for the shop to sell, like 9K watches from his personal collection. Just gave them to us. We had a charity pot for children with cancer, and people would give us like spare change. One day he just rocked up and put 100 in cash in it. We heard that one year he rented Simon Cowell's private island for Christmas for him and a bunch of friends. Turns out that he was the mastermind behind a now infamous tax scam that had a lot of famous people involved. He had to declare bankruptcy in the end, but you know how that really works with rich people. I'm sort of 90 sure that he only bought the business as some sort of money laundering thing or tax cheat. Story 70. Chris Klein. He was a coal baron with some operations here in WV. My uncle was a superintendent at one of his mines. He hired me one summer to fill in for the security guys that went on vacation. I basically parked at the bottom of the mountain and stopped vehicles going up to the mines. I had specific instructions not to stop his vehicle, but he was pretty cool and stopped on his own accord and chatted me up. He bragged to my uncle one time that his yacht was moored at the same place as Tiger Woods' yacht. His was supposedly bigger than Tiger's. Kinda gross, but I met the guy. Story 71. At an airport, my father recognized and approached an old colleague and his wife. We were introduced, just the nicest older couple you could ever imagine. As they walked away, my father pat me on the shoulder and said, "Congratulations, you just shook hands with your first billionaire." Story 72. I am friends with an ultra-high net worth individual, 250, 500 men range, and his old school money with a well-known family name. Went to a party at his house and was introduced to an old family money name from Europe. Guy was worth over 10 billion. Actually a very interesting person. Didn't look down at anyone and really only wanted to discuss Champions League football, which was fun. Story 73. My friend's dad was the most unassuming guy you'd ever meet. He wore clothes until they fell apart, was a gargoyle at the local bars, collected, read hoarded junk, and was generally a well-liked smart jerk around town. He served in the army, saw the world, and if you bought him an old mill, he would get you tipsy the whole night. He also heavily invested in the stock market, particularly Google, Facebook, Apple, a lot of stuff early on in their startups. So much so that after he passed, my friend doesn't have to work. He just lives off dividends and plays PC games. He sold most of the rental properties because he didn't want to deal with tenants anymore. But yeah, my friend's dad was probably the richest person I had. No clue was actually filthy rich. Story 74. David Beckham at a local golf course. I was only walking across it, but he was visiting friends Gordon Ramsay down here, and he was walking his dogs, and I just so happened to cross him, and we exchanged welcomed and carried on. Story 75. Working for Twitter, I was in meetings with Jack Dorsey a number of times, but I was also in the room when Dmitry Medvedev, Vladimir Putin's puppet president during his term-limited hiatus, visited the office. I'm guessing he's far wealthier than most Silicon Valley overlords. Story 76. My realtor kept saying we should hang on his boat and do some fishing for the last few months. Finally, the day arrived a few weeks ago when the temps were at their peak on the East Coast. Me being me, put on a good amount of sunblock on my face, hands, and neck, grabbed a hat and my Ray-Bans, and off I went to the dock when he's asked to meet. I show up there, and it's a 100-foot yacht with rooms, kitchen, bar, and AC in every room. I have never felt so poor in my life. Story 77. I met Yang Glenn while walking in Dulwich Village 3 years ago. I'm pretty sure that's the richest person I've ever personally spoken to. He was a really nice guy. Had a conversation with him about how it was a shame about the last season and got a photo with him. Posted it to our Game of Thrones, and it was the highlight of my year to get all that free karma. Story 78. Casper Van Dien, Ernie Hudson, David Yost, and Mindy Sterling, all at the same time. I was lucky enough to run a panel at a Comic-Con in the Midwest. They were all super cool and not the slightest bit arrogant. Story 79. Me. I had great parents, aunts and uncles, cousins. Married 38 years, 2 great kids, 3, counting, grandkids, great friends. Am still in decent condition health-wise. How much richer can anyone be? Story 80. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. I worked for Apple right after they started production. Talked with them daily. Story 81. A piece of trash dictator-ish in a Middle Eastern country. Absolute trash. Didn't respect them at all. Only trait that superseded all was pure narcissism. She treated her guards, security, like trash. Story 82. A Buddhist monk in a temple in Nepal. He had been a monk for the past 25 years. Incredible guy. Edit. He was obviously not money rich. He was rich in happiness, which I consider more important. Story 83. A guy who started one or the early medical cannabis companies that he sold after recreational legalization and is a well-known brand where I live today. Story 84. I think Georgy Greshko. He was a famous person and was involved in business. Among people whose net worth I know at least with some level of certainty, my wife's brother, he has 2-3 million. But I'm almost sure Greshko was richer. Story 85. Jamie Mousen. Noted Mexican media personality, UFO, and supplement huckster. He was a business partner of a family member. He spent the evening drinking tequila and passing around what he claimed were priceless, authentic, ancient Olmec, Aztec, Toltec, etc. relics, including a large solid jade jaguar skull. Story 86. Todd Wanick, owner of Ashley Furniture and worth over $4 billion. He tours the factories often, and I was an employee for a few years. Story 87. I have a client at my work who sold his national motel chain at 75-ish. He comes in and buys expensive vehicles all the time. He said I have like 10-15 years left, and I intend on blowing all the money I spent my life working for. Super nice, and also what a flex. His wife passed, and his kids got their share, so he wants to die with nothing in his accounts. Story 88. I used to sell Range Rovers. I sold a couple to a guy who owned the mortgage company. I also have a cousin who was friends with a sheikh in the UAE. Met him one time. Nice guy. Story 89. Guy that owned a clinical software company that has a big contract with many hospitals around the world. At the time, he must have been a single-digit millionaire, but this probably took him close to three-digit millionaire. Nice guy TBH, he invited us to some local event and bought us dinner and drinks. Never been wooed like that before or since for my job. Story 90, Kirk Kerkorian. Early 90s, me at a benefit at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He was with a small entourage of people. He was a warm, welcoming man and had great eye contact. One of those people of whom you could say, he made you feel like you were the only person in the room he was interested in talking to. Story 91. I went to elementary school with a buffet, but I also married into a family with a very rich, self-made uncle. Like almost billionaire status at this point. Story 92. I dated a girl in New Orleans whose father was a lawyer in New York. He had a multi-story apartment in Manhattan with a real Ming vase in the fore. Story 93. Ex-Chief Minister of Sarawak Taib Mahmud and ex-Prime Minister of Malaysia Mahathir saw them in events and shoot. Both are billionaires as they have embezzled that much while being in power for at least 2 decades for the Prime Minister and 3 decades for the Chief Minister. Nobody else comes close to both their wealth. Mahathir was known as the King of the West and Taib the King of the East. Story 94. A banker worth around $400 million at the time. He is now probably closer to the big Billy mark due to his very impressive art collection. He came to a gallery I was working out with a girl who I assume was his daughter until she was introduced at his GF. He wore ironed jeans and a classic white shirt with a V-neck jumper. Totally ordinary, but the cowboy boots with spurs were an unexpected twist. He was fine, neither rude nor friendly. He spoke to a few artists, of whom he was a patron, so lots of small talk and chit-chat sort of stuff. Story 95. I met Kate Blanchett and Steven Soderbergh at the same time. I'm not sure who out of those two was worth more money, but I'm guessing they're both pretty well off. Story 96. I work in NP. I've met one of our richer donors and watched him roll up to our fundraiser, buy $300K in auction items, including a car, and then just turn around and donate it all back, and then donate multiple buildings in the following months. Unfudge real. Story 97. A lot of rich people don't necessarily tell you. That said, I knew a friend of mine and her husband had a lot of money that husband made in tech. One time had forgotten her house number and Googled her. Turns out Googling Jane Richfriend gave a lot of results of many local charities and a university thanking John and Jane Richfriend for donating at the 50,000, 90,000 level. Story 98. Old girlfriend's dad was a railroad baron of sorts in South America. Their railroad infrastructure came a bit later than here in the U.S. I never tried to peg a number to his wealth, but it was absurd, probably a few billions. He and the family were quite humble about it all, but there were some excellent perks to dating her for a few years. Story 99. I've grew up with John Smolt's son and have been to his house. A distant family member was married to Kate Hudson, who I met a few times in the Urajos, and I've served coffee to Alex Rodriguez, Brian Jordan, and John Rocker as a barista. I've also stood in line to the bathroom with Usher. It's probably about half to $1 billion worth of net worth if you add them all up. Story 100. Funny story, didn't know who he was at the time, but met a very popular male porn star called James Dean about 10 years ago. He asked me for a lighter. We talked for about 10 minutes. Nice guy. After looking him up, it made a lot of sense why he had 3 beautiful women sitting with him. Story 101. His name was John Brown. He was my dad's friend when I was a kid. Had a giant house, an original Shelby AC Cobra, and had a Class 3 machine gun shop just for fun. Story 102. The man I met had a fleet of 25 various kinds of airplanes. I don't know how rich he was, but he did offer me a Jaguar if I went on a date with him. I declined because I was married. In hindsight, I should have left my shoot husband and took the car. Story 103. Male body part Ewingling, the owner of the brewery, is an acquaintance of mine. Dude is a billionaire, but he drives a Toyota Camry. It's very common to see him out at a gas station or in the grocery store. Still shows up to work every day and unload trucks. Story 104. Afroman. But the fact that he was performing at a plant substance store in a small city in Canada makes me question his recent financial decisions. Pretty cool concert though, lol. Story 105. I've met a plethora of professional athletes and a couple Saudi royals, so you'd imagine the royal family members take the cake by quite a large margin. Some of the athletes include Josh Cribbs, Darnell Dinkins, OBJ, LeBron, and all of the Seattle Mariners players from 2002 through 2005. Met the royal family members when they got off their private jet at an FBO near the Cleveland Clinic. Story 106. IDK. I've met several in my business and just hanging around where I live in South Florida. I saw Bill Gates at a bar in Boca. I had nothing to say to him, really, so we just ate our lunch in peace. To be honest, I'm glad he didn't recognize me and ask for an autograph. I was in no mood. Story 107. I PM'd a project for Larry Ellison, his ex-wife, Melanie, in the mid-2000s. Got to know both of them fairly well. Story 108. Tough to say because I don't really ask people what they're worth, but I once sold a $20 million horse farm for a guy that was across the street from his castle, so I'm gonna guess him. Story 109. I work in automotive. Many dealer group owners are obscenely wealthy, but meeting Rick Hendrick was pretty insane. He gave me a tour of his car museum, easily a couple billion, yes billion, in cars just sitting there on display. That wasn't even close to his whole collection. Story 110. Billionaire dude who lives across the street from Mully Uncle. He made it with rehabs all over the country, retired now in a modest home, and he gives it all away to charities. Story 111. This guy I met at a cocktail tech mixer while I was living in the Silicon Valley, who was a liquidator for old tech within the Fortune 500 companies in the Silicon Valley, who casually said his company netted $24 billion the following year. Dude didn't even look like money either. Just a average-looking guy wearing Crocs, LOL. Checks out though, because I did my research on him and his company later on, and he was spot on. Super nice guy too. Story 112. When I was a journalist, I met Danny DeVito on a press junket for the inconsequential film Other People's Money. He tried to be funny, but came off as crass and insulting of my state, where the film was partially shot. Gregory Peck was at that same press conference, and I can confidently say I have never encountered another human being with as much quiet class, effortless charisma, and absolute handsomeness as that man. I'm the farthest thing from gay, but hello, sailor. Story 113. Ben Stein. My aunt and I befriended him at the airport, and we all still have dinner sometimes. Definitely an odd guy, LOL. Story 114. I met Betsy DeVos. She did a tour of our college, and I was one of the faculty delegates selected to meet her. It was me and a group of honor students. She said maybe 5 words to me total and looked through everyone like they weren't worth thinking about. Didn't ask me any questions about teaching or my experience teaching. Didn't really say anything to the students either. They all shared their experiences. She only lit up for the homeschooled student. Him she asked about a half dozen questions. She was the coldest person I've ever met. Story 115. Oh God, I don't know. Steven Schwartzman? Does the future king of Qatar count? Steve Cohen? Probably Bill Gates, but he had less money then. Story 116. Met as in, talked briefly and had something signed, or met as in, I got to hold a conversation with this person that lasted more than 2 minutes. Story 117. Hard to tell. I've met some owners of hotel chains, massive businesses, at least one Russian oligarch, a world-renowned professional driver, and so on. So hard to tell. Story 118. He was involved in real estate, and he also did a lot of local charity work. Unfortunately, he passed away recently. Story 119. Couple decades ago, I met the CEO, founder of Progressive Insurance. I think we was pretty loaded. Story 120. I met several members of the UAE royal family. Distant runner-up was my uncle who came from Ireland in the 1930s, was a small-time thief, got his business degree, invented prefab windows, became CEO of Xerox, started a Mary Kay-style business scheme, co-owned the Dallas Mavericks in the mid-80s, and a private jet. He took us to a game where we sat courtside. He lived a good life and died in his 90s about 5 years ago. Story 121. Probably a tech executive? I mean, I've been to a lot of conventions for OEMs. I couldn't say how rich any of them were. What's another dude in a tech t-shirt? Story 122. Millionaire. Kept it low-key, though. Drove a Camry. Picked my poor jerk up for our weekly group meetings. All-around good guy. Story 123. I honestly probably don't know. Most of the gazillionaires I've met and/or worked with are very discreet. Story 124. Dated a girl in high school whose family owned a chain of department stores. Their house looked like a funeral home. The thing that sticks with me is that the bedroom doors were wallpapered, so they just blended in with the walls, like on Dynasty or Dallas. I'd never seen that before. Story 125. Met and had a lengthy conversation with Tim Berners-Lee at a workshop once. Not sure how rich he actually is. I also sat next to the Danish PM on a plane once. I guess he was pretty rich. Other than that, probably the former CEO of the company I work at had a meeting or two with him. There are not that many ultra-rich people in my country. I did meet the son of the Lego CEO at a festival, though. Story 126. I was a massage therapist in California for over 30 years. I worked on a guy who's the house manager for a real power couple. They had an apartment in NY, a house in New England, a place in Florida, a large house in Pebble Beach where I gave them massage. They each had a jet, each house had staff, cook, manager, assistant, etc. The wife had been on TV, written a book, etc. The husband made his money in mineral mining. They had the nicest 2 Labrador retrievers. Story 127. Dan Duncan of Houston, Texas, before he passed away 15 years ago, was worth about $10 billion. I've also met Kelsey Warren. Story 128. Myself and some of my co-workers at Comcast won a contest to go to Universal Studios, and part of it was a QA and handshakes with the board. Brian Roberts was the wealthiest hand in the room. Story 129. Not sure who'd be the richer of them, but I met Jerry West and Dr. J. Also played poker with one of the Bone Thugs and Jerome Betty's. Also John Calipari. Story 130. Not sure who ranked highest. I was in commercial banking, so a lot of our clients had high net worths. Story 131. Hedge fund manager who has a house down here in SENC. I tried to stay out of his way and mostly mingled with the house staff. Story 132. I did security at a private birthday party for one of the wives from Canada's Dragon's Den, one of whom is also been on Shark Tank in the US. $800 million between the 2 couples. Story 133. Met and chatted with Elon a few times. Steve Ballmer was nice. Chatted about music genres. We were at an after party outside because the music sucked lol. Story 134. I guess some famous Dutch TV host or something. Or maybe the king queen, but I'm not sure how rich they are, haha. Story 135. I used to wait tables in San Francisco. I've waited on several billionaires. I don't know their names anymore, but at the time, co-workers would comment that I was serving a billionaire. Story 136. Ran into Mark Cuban at Disneyland. Got a cool picture with him took. Fillets him for what he is doing to combat the pharmaceutical companies. Story 137. I met Bob Parson at a GoDaddy Christmas party. Bob had a massive chocolate-colored diamond in one of his ears and thought my ex's ears were cool, so he fingered one hole. Story 138. I was in my early 20s pushing boxes at a Meijer while in college when a coworker showed me his $1 million retirement fund. LOL. I asked why he was working there. He said he wanted to get out of the house, lol. Story 139. Used to work with owners of Groupon after they became billionaires. They were still wealthy before Groupon, but added another comma to their wealth. Story 140. David Duffield, who started PeopleSoft and Workday, went to school with his adopted son, Matt. He got shipped to military school one day out of the blue. My younger brother grew up with one of his non-adopted kids. Story 141. Someone who had a crush on me. He was doing illegal business. He had a luxurious car and a lot of money on his bank account. Story 142. Mark Cuban one Sunday afternoon in the Old Borders bookstore in Old Town Shopping Center off Greenville Ave in Dallas. He was in the periodical section, leaned against a wall reading a magazine. I just came up, introduced myself, said, "Nice to meet you, Mr. Cuban," then shook his hand. He was very nice, personable, and gracious. Story 143. If you live in a major city and in a nice enough area, you're surrounded by them. I've met billionaires, people who own sports teams, private equity people, etc. Wouldn't be able to tell you who the richest is. Story 144. I walked right by Michael Rubin coming out of the Capitol Grill at the Sloan Analytics Conference in 2019. I think it was him and Katie Nolan. No posse or security. Story 145. IDK if anybody follows NASCAR, but I had the gentleman that owns Dover Speedway walk into my bar. In a room full of NASCAR execs and other high-profile people, everybody shut their mouths and were silent when he walked in. Every single man stood up, shook his hand, and offered their seat to him. I don't know his net worth, but I've never seen someone command a room like that in my life. He covered everyone's bill, tipped well, and was a very nice man. Story 146. I was friends with them before they were famous, but now they are an NFL starting player. Does that count? Story 147. I've met many celebs in passing, but had breakfast with Mike Mills, guitarist from REM, one morning. He was dating a friend of mine at the time. Nice guy. Story 148. Jessica Alba, most likely. I've also met Gary Sinise, Gwen Stefani, Joey Fatone, Susan Lucci, and a few NHL players. Also went to high school with a few guys that would be drafted into the NHL, including a 1 overall pick, but they didn't have money when I knew them. One of the members of the Saudi royal family stayed at the hotel I was working at, but I don't think I ever actually met them. Story 149. Met an NFL player in Tampa whose brother, or cousin, is Frenzo Bayu, my friend. Dude is a monster in size, but super laid back. Didn't let us buy not one round that night, lol. Story 150. No, one super famous or rich. But my company hired a C-list British actress for an advert voiceover recently. We paid her $20K for 30 minutes work. My take-home is $27K a bloody year, and I'm in a higher wage bracket and considered to be doing quite well. It's a different world for those kind of people. Story 151. A dude who was the richest and largest employer of people in South House. Don't know what he was worth, but it would be in the several billions. Mostly he was terribly rude. He was a client of mine and had asked a question about one of his purchases that I had researched for several weeks and then needed just a yes or no, and it'd get either Y or N. Not a yes, thanks, or a no thanks, or a thanks for looking into that, but let's leave it. Something that was half human. Just a Y or an N. Story 152. Jeremy Jacobs. He's worth about 4.5 B. I know his reputation, but he was always good to us. Golf club staff, gave us decent tips, and was never very difficult. Always enjoyed talking to us too. I think he would get bored of his lawyer finance friends. Story 153. My wife's cousin, Luther, he bought a new double wide recently, and we helped him take the wheels off so they could install the underpinning. It's a sweet deal. Got a glamour bath too. Story 154. I spent an afternoon with Steve Case. He seemed oddly normal, intense but not over the top. I've known people who acted like they were a much bigger deal, who were managers at a local retail shop. Story 155. Jerry Bruckheimer. I worked on at least 15 of his movies in post-production sound. I was a staff technician, and by choice, I never tried to engage with clients if it didn't pertain to the current job. I think he felt at home with us. He joined me at lunch and asked questions like, how has the transition from analog to digital sound affected you? He didn't need to engage. He honestly gave us what I thought. That's just one example. Most people at his level have no idea what we do, and some of them become hostile instead of admitting their lack of knowledge. Story 156. My old boss after showing me his new Rari. See, if you keep working hard the way you do, I can afford a second one. Great mentor, helped me set up a proprietary program, and when I sold it to the company, he didn't want to cut. I'm the second richest person I know. Story 157. Bill Gates at some kind of pop culture museum in Washington, D.C., though it was less of a meeting and more of me saying hi, followed by the very large black man that was following him gently pushing me away. Story 158. Richard Branson. Also met The Edge from U2 and Dennis Rodman. I think Dennis may have lost all his money though, LOL. Story 159. Met Lawrence Taylor before he became an intimacy offender and had money. Ain't no big deal now as his net worth is right around 200,000, down from 50 million. Story 160. Richard Branson. Nice guy, super chill. We had a nice conversation before an event I was part of the production team on. Story 161. Ken Grossman, founder of Sierra Nevada. Estimated worth was $1 billion in 2014, around the time I met him. Story 162. I've met a ton of celebrities, so I have no idea. Maybe Post Malone? Other than that, my mom's boss who owned multiple houses. Story 163. Mic'd up Kevin Leary for a corporate event. He was surprisingly short and insisted on a handheld microphone for his talk. Also wanted to check his slides while we were live and running the event. Story 164. I went to one of Sean Parker's parties in DC years ago. He had a prototype touchscreen phone way before anything Apple put out. This was like in 1999. Story 165. In Generation 4, the money paid for my college, but then it was all gone, and I never figured out how to make or save much. Story 166. I've briefly spoken to a couple of different people who were worth tens of millions. Brooks Mileson when he was using Gretna FC as his personal plaything, and the other was the director of a company I worked for. Story 167. Tier Tukin, near mine. Been relatively close to billionaires a couple of times in my life. In my adolescence, I was within 2 degrees of a separation of the heir to a brewing conglomerate. Met him a few times. And later in life, for a few months, I hung out with one of the grandchildren of who at the time was the richest woman in the world, widow of a construction mogul in the third world. The heir was a nice guy, smart, likable. The grandson was also smart, but kind of useless. Story 168. Fred Smith's son came to my FedEx station with a bunch of executives when I used to work for FedEx. He was saying hello and shaking everyone's hand in the break room, but not much interaction besides that. Story 169. In my previous life in the corporate world, I dealt with lots of millionaires and billionaires. Also rich politicians. Almost invariably, the politicians were the worst, throwing their weight around and expecting people to be subservient. The nicest guy was someone whose name you would never know, but when I found out who he was, my PA whispered his name in my ear. I gasped and said, "You're joking." She said, "That's him, boss." Soft-spoken, dressed simply, but very well. No airs about him in spite of the fact he controlled something like half the economy. We ended up closing down the bar in a small hotel with long conversations about cars because he was a petrol head. After a week or so, my PA gets a call from his asking me to come over. There's a car I have to see. We're friends to this day, and no one in my circle knows. Not my family, not my friends. I think he appreciates that I don't use the friendship for any sort of personal or professional gain. Story 170. I work in Medina, WA. I've met many very wealthy people. Some suck, most are absolutely great. I cannot share any of their names given the nature of my work, healthcare. Story 171. I met Leonard Nimoy, Spock from Star Trek, when I was little, early 70s. He was at some Star Trek event at a local toy store, and Mom was a huge fan and dragged my sister and I along with her to see him. OMG, such a huge crowd. Story 172. I worked with Larry Ellison while he was the wealthiest person in the world, so I guess that counts. Honorable mention, around that same time I had lunch with Steve Jobs. Story 173. Didn't quite meet him, but one time Adam Sandler got takeout from a Chinese place I was eating at in Pacific Palisades. Story 174. Guy named Mike, who was the owner of the business brothers worked at. He also owned the majority of a local bank. Dude used to frequent the strip club on a daily and allotted himself a budget of $5,000 per day like it was nothing, LOL. Story 175. A senator who I am not fond of, known for his car dealerships, baseball players, business owners, doctors, lawyers, and a few actors. Mostly the kindest people, however. Some shoot bags as well. That's the grab bag of human, no? Side note, I was working. So I was a metaphorical fly on the wall and wouldn't have bothered them anyway, unless it was like a concert or something. But that's different too. Story 176. My ex, their family owned a major business in Africa. They're probably worth well over $200 million. Was offered an exec position there. If I would have moved there, said no. Let's just say I haven't decided if I regret saying no. Story 177. Quentin Tarantino at a bar in Austin around 2003. I asked him if I could just shake his hand. He said absolutely, and he was really nice. Conversing with everyone there and having a good time. That was cool. Story 178. I danced with Mark Cuban at a bar club in Portland, OR. I had no idea who he was. He was dancing with me and my friend. Not exactly sure if it's related, but when I went to get a drink, someone poured a drink down my back. I didn't know who it was until the next day. Story 179. Paul Allen. I used to work for a startup of his back in the 90s in Seattle. There was a stretch when he would let all the employees of his companies, not MSoft, use his estate on Mercer Island on Mondays. We would be surrounded by Dale Chihuly artwork, sitting in a massive hot tub, watching Melrose Place on a big screen. Or we'd watch first-run movies in his private screening room. He would swing by the office once in a while, and sometimes he would have people flown down to Portland in his private jet to sit courtside at a Blazers game. They'd get flown back up that night and be in the office the next day. That never happened to me. I wasn't a cute female, but it happened to several women I worked with. Story 180. Satya Nadella, Microsoft CEO, John Stanton, majority owner of the Mariners, Jerry DiPoto, GM of the Mariners, John L. Scott, CEO of one of the largest real estate firms in the PNW, Jamie Nordstrom, president of Nordstrom, one of the U-Haul founders' children, big-time monthly allowance, a lot of local wealthy business owners, people high up in tech, retired people formerly high up in tech, a bunch of Seahawks players, some Mariners players, Sir Mix-a-Lot, and a lot more people that made money in all sorts of ways. Most interesting was a lady that won the lottery on the East Coast and moved out west to start a new life. If I remember correctly when I Googled her, she won a couple $100 million, or maybe it was $60 million. Either way, a shitload of money. Thought she was lying until I Googled it. Story 181. I had dinner with a billionaire who owned a casino and hotel, possibly other properties, but that's what I was told. He and his wife seemed alarmingly normal. Story 182. Not really certain, but I was chatting to Tom Holland the other day. Met Matt Smith a few weeks ago. Also been to Carol Voderman's house and met Jude Law. I guess they're up there. But maybe the owner of a company I did some subcontracting for a while ago. That dude was loaded, like had a jag. Lamborghini, Ferrari for each day of the week, sort of rich. Story 183. David Rubenstein at this fundraiser thing. In the grand scheme of jerk billionaires, his jerk smells a millimeter less. Story 184. I've met a number of Russian billionaires. The only one who is famous is Pavel Durov, who copied the Russian Facebook called VKontakte and also Telegram. He probably had less money than some of the oil and steel oligarchs kleptocrats I met through private teaching and tutoring. Story 185. Pretty sure I turned down Michael Jordan's autograph as a kid, if that counts. He didn't know what to do. Story 186. I went to school with the Sultan of Brunei's sons and nephews and the son of the president of Tunisia. The former were by far wealthier, I think, but the president's son was way flashier. Cars, clothes, attitude, gifts. Everything about him was over the top. The Sultan of Brunei's family were very low-key, but there were security everywhere at our school. Story 187. Probably the guy who invented the iPod and then founded Nest. Although Tiger Woods might be almost in the same ballpark. Story 188. I met the founder of Fenway Sports Group at an event many years ago. FSG owns Liverpool, the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the Red Sox. Really nice guy. One of those people you'd never guess was incomprehensibly rich unless you knew him. Story 189. I bartender in Miami for decades. Meet a lot of famous people. P. Diddy gave me a $10,000 tip. At the time it didn't register, it was a band of 100 bills. And in my head, I thought it was a 1,000 and I was really excited about it. I'm not sure how much he was worth at the time. Billy Bush Jr. used to come into a nightclub I worked at. He was really nice. I also saw Paris Hilton private pictures. Kobe was in Jerk. Vanilla Ice was really funny and wouldn't go into the VIP area. Shaquille's hands are so big it was weird handing him drinks. They're more than I remember right now. Every time I saw Colin Farrell, he was absolutely trashed, but nice enough. Story 190. I met Jamie Dimon in the late 90s at a Bank One reception for mid-sized business customers. Our company banker was very stoked to introduce us to him, shook that man's hand. Many years later, I was an EA for a partner in a smallish hedge fund who was worth 47 mil. Story 191. I met Samuel L. Jackson once. He was flying economy between Chicago and Seattle. I helped him with his bags. Story 192. Aside from a few random celebrities, the owner of the company I used to work for bought an end table for $60K. That just blew my mind. Story 193. Like actually interacted with would be Sir Terry Pratchett. I also shared a wave with Elizabeth II once, but I'm not sure that counts. Story 194. Met some NBA players at a coffee shop last year. Richest person I know is my cousin's friend who created a really popular Roblox game. Nothing like being a millionaire in your early 20s. Story 195. Sherry Cotton owns a children's bookshop in my neighborhood. When she first opened it up, we talked to her for about 15 minutes about all her plants without having any idea who she was. She founded Meridian Health and sold it a few years back for 2.5B. Very nice lady, does a ton of philanthropic stuff around Detroit. Too bad her son is a huge piece of shoot. Story 196. Used to work for Microsoft and interacted with Bill G multiple times during a period of time where he was the wealthiest person in the world. He's been nothing but nice to me during and after my Microsoft tenure, and I have nothing but nice things to say about him. Story 197. Madonna. Her family's winery is not far from my family's lake house in northern MI. Her dad and youngest brother are acquaintances with my uncle. Story 198. Met Bezos and Lauren Sanchez through work. Honestly, they were really nice. He has the most elite security team I've ever experienced. Story 199. I guess the richest person is the old dude who owned basically every single McDonald's in my city, which is quite a few. I remember my first Sunday working St. McDonald's as a 15-year-old, and some old dude just walks into the back and is helping himself to stuff. I was so close to stopping him, but noticed no one else was batting an eye. Once he grabbed his coffee or whatever, someone came over and told me, and I was so glad I kept my mouth shut. Story 200. I've met multiple millionaires, one of which owned the company I worked for back in the day. He drove a Toyota. I never saw him drive anything else, LOL, that impressed me more than anything. Super humble guy. Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. If you'd like to see more content like this, you might be interested to know that I've created another channel with a similar theme, especially for those of you who enjoy what I do. I'll leave a link in the description, and I hope to see you there. Take care.